Good evening, and welcome to tonight's meeting. This is a workshop meeting, so there will be no business transacted except for a special meeting that we'll be holding at the end for an executive session. So, Madam Superintendent, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Chairman Flores, and good evening, everyone. We have a two-part workshop today, and I'll frame it before turning it over to Lisa Hammersley, our first presenter. I'll present the second half. First presentation, the content will be related to a presentation that was already made to the Finance Committee by Education Resource Strategies around our sustainability planning. As you know, this is work that we are carrying over from last year and is part of our priority around operational effectiveness. And so the reason why we wanted to lift this is because this provides the backdrop and context for us as we kick off our budget development process. So I will turn it over to Lisa, and know that we are not going to go through the entire presentation, but the content in the presentation will be available for everyone.
Thank you very much. As previously stated, my name is Lisa Hammersley. I'm currently one of a number of individuals that are serving as the interim CFO. I will try my best to answer any questions that you have. However, this was a work product of Education Resource Strategies, so to the extent that you have questions, I'll certainly take them down and follow up with them. So let's look at the Hartford Public Schools challenges that you're currently facing. First of all, you have a higher bar for student learning and increased needs. This is coupled with unsustainable cost structures as well as declining enrollment. And as you know, when you have declining enrollment, you also see a reduction in your revenue sources. So if nothing changes by fiscal year 2022, expenditures will exceed revenue by $31 million. There are 7 key drivers to Hartford Public Schools deficit. The first is student with disabilities outplaced tuition, followed by student with disabilities open choice tuition, student with disabilities magnet school tuition, non-student with disabilities magnet school tuition, revenue decline, and employee compensation. So each driver is influenced by the enrollment decline. Over 75% of your projected deficit is going to an out-of-district provider. As previously mentioned, the district loses state and federal revenue as its enrollment reduces. And while employee compensation is a large expenditure for Hartford Public Schools, the per pupil, their increase is actually not as significant as the other cost drivers. However, as you have enrollment being reduced, the per pupil cost increases. We see that enrollment decline spans all grades in schools, so it's district-wide. So absent a change, Hartford Public Schools needs to slow the rate expense increases or restructure existing resources. Over half of Hartford Public Schools deficit is going to out-of-district providers, as previously mentioned. Hartford has a unique challenge because 30% of the students that are identified as having disabilities attend a non-Hartford public school. Hartford is also unique in that 11% of the students with disabilities are attending a private placement. This is double the statewide average and almost 3 times what Bridgeport and New Haven have experienced.
I was just clarifying process here. So 3 times more likely of outplacing students than any other district.
Correct.
In the state.
Correct.
That's us.
That's Hartford Public Schools, correct. Which, has a direct impact on your deficit. Statewide, there's no control over how much these outplacements can charge your district. I like to refer to it as the Wild West. The state auditors have recently started to look at this issue. And I would definitely recommend that your district, as well as all districts statewide, start to advocate for some kind of cost structure to be in place and set by the State Department of Education so that there could really be more control over this expense. But Hartford is not unique in the fact that private providers charge a lot of money, unfortunately, and that there's no control over how much they can increase their rates. Unfortunately for Hartford Public Schools, you have more students in that setting, so therefore it's going to impact your deficit greatly.
It is something that I know that Dr. Sellers, continues to raise for us in terms of not having capacity at all to, be out there across all of these providers to monitor quality and service provision to determine whether or not it aligns with the bills that we're getting.
Absolutely. So Black and Latinx students are more likely to receive IEPs and are more likely to be served outside of the district once they have an IEP, ERS has found. So of the $17 million contribution to deficit, $8 million can be explained by increasing enrollment in magnet and open choice schools. And the data suggests that it's not that these students that are attending a non-Hartford public school are identified as having disabilities more than any other, or any student attending Hartford public schools. It appears that the proportion of students with IEP is approximately the same.
In our schools, and then students that are ours attending magnets or open choice.
Exactly.
It is the same.
It's not the data does not suggest an over-identification at magnet schools or open choice schools. So as previously mentioned, rising tuition costs for private outplacements contributes approximately $9 million to the deficit. That's where having some kind of class structure imposed by the State Department of Education would help you with that expense. And they also looked at where students are placed. There's a large concentration of students that attend high-cost private outplacements.
Go ahead. Slide 20.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. How do we know what is the high-priced facility versus what are the regular facilities? Are all these high-priced facilities on this particular paper?
So the high-cost facilities are the ones where the green dot is going to be higher along the axis. Now, I do know that the Child Advocate has been looking into these private outplacement providers to see if they're providing the level of care that they should be. And I know that she's interested in working with your district about identifying which providers provide the education at the best possible price. So as Hartford moves forward, you could identify those providers that students do receive a great educational opportunity and have a reduced cost structure. So I don't know where I am on my time, but so what can Hartford Public Schools do to minimize the negative fiscal impact of placing students in out-of-district settings? You could reduce the over-identification of students with disabilities or reduce placement for certain students with disabilities. You can reduce private school tuition costs by auditing those private providers and negotiating fees. And you could try and create some in-district specialized services to mitigate the need to outplace those students. And advocate for additional state funding. So you could advocate for a new ECS funding rate to account for the student with disabilities. And as I previously mentioned, advocate for greater oversight of the charges that are assessed against local public school districts. ERS also looks at the fact that as you grapple with the deficit, you're going to need to preserve as much of the DME as you possibly can, as you just recently rolled out. So this is a graphic that they put together that lays out the different pieces of the puzzle that Hartford Public Schools has to deal with in the upcoming few months. Do you have any further questions?
I have a comment. Because a couple of years ago, I assisted a parent in a PPT. And it's funny because a couple of the highest priced ones are the ones that Hartford Public Schools was recommending. So because the parent did not know. She just knew she needed another setting. It wasn't permanent, and I'm looking at the highest ones, and those are the only ones that were on the table. So that's confusing.
Yeah,
Right here.
at times, it also has to do with the level of service that a student needs. I'm not sure what this specific student needed.
It was just to determine what the
To go
student
look.
needed. It wasn't even,
A diagnostic placement.
yeah, so,
Yeah, I don't know if all of these, and I'm looking at Dr. Sellers, but, when we have a 45-day diagnostic placement, not sure if all of these facilities do the diagnostics for us, but the ones that you're referencing, we know specifically do the 45-day placement.
and that 45-day turned into a school year and a half. And that's what happened, because he gets there and then you figure out, oh, we need to do this, so, I don't know. I think we could be better about, of course, doing the best thing for the student, but at the same time, if another provider can provide a service, and the price is a better price, I think we definitely need to be intentional about that.
Fully agree.
Can I just ask a question? I think, going back to the comment, and thank you, Mrs. Brody, for mentioning this. The 45-day diagnostic, one of the things you mentioned was that which facilities do that. Is it that, it sounds like we have an opportunity to potentially have other options for the 45-day diagnostic. I know certain students are in certain situations, sometimes it may be more appropriate, et cetera. But I know one of the things that we've been talking about is what supports and information and education we can also provide to our staff. And I'm just thinking about if we go beyond the 45 days, and I know I've heard of stories where the diagnostic has not been completed within the 45 days, and if these are high-price facilities, is there some other type of process or system or additional facilities that we can consider? I just think it might be an opportunity there because, I'm sure all of us have heard of the young person still being in one of these facilities and still in the diagnostic phase. So I just wanted to tag that on to what Mrs. Brody said.
So I don't know if we have looked at, if we've done an audit, to determine whether or not the 45 days, the diagnostic has happened within the 45 days. That would be very interesting data for us to have. And I know that Dr. Sellers' team can get that data. I'm not sure what would happen if the 45 days, come and go and the diagnostic is not done, does the child stay as in a placement?
Typically, I thought they did.
Chad, they do.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering then, which it might be to your question, is it no longer that we're paying for the diagnostic and now we're actually paying for a placement without
A diagnosis.
And I think some of it has to do with the capacity of the home school. My son was the same situation that Ms. Browdy just described. He went in for a diagnostic and he was there for a year. And a big part of it was the school's either capacity or willingness to take him back and provide needed accommodations.
So we can definitely do an audit as to what are those drivers? What is the reason why it doesn't happen, in the 45 days? And when it doesn't, then what happens? What are the cost implications for us? And then what is the implication on the programming and service delivery for the student once the diagnostic is done and an IEP has been determined?
I have this one other question. Is transportation included in these figures? Or no? Because I know that we have some kids that might be transported by their parents, but you have other kids in the white cabs with the
Yeah?
transported.
From my understanding, they are not included in that figure,
Just tuition.
just tuition. I do know that the transportation contract was recently renegotiated, so it's not a contributor towards your deficit that you're facing in the next few years.
Really? So is that transportation cost still over 20 million? Because
Yep.
then it does.
It's not it's not going
But
up.
it's not going up, but if we have a high number of kids that are placed outside of district,
Mhm.
that's a factor, is all I'm trying to say. I
Yeah,
get what
I
you're
see.
Absolutely, and I was just referring to regular
Yeah, I got you.
transportation.
We know that as one of the recommendations, which is to determine, could we and when can we add some of these programs in-house? Before doing any of that, we know that we have to really assess what's currently happening, which might be one of the questions that we include when we engage a consulting firm to do the assessment of our special education programs and our cost drivers there. That is, if you recall, the Municipal Accountability Review Board last year had not expressed interest, actually they had requested that we use some of the funds that they could potentially allocate for this assessment. I don't know if there's an update from the MARB on that.
So from what I understand, there's $250,000 that has been identified by the mayor that he would like to support with a special education study. And as soon as a scope of work is put together, they're happy to engage and get a consultant on board to help Hartford Public Schools.
And
How much was that again? I'm sorry.
250. We did have conversations last year about the fact that 250 potentially would not be sufficient. Could be the audit that is done and then is the audit, right? There would be no action plan development. So we should consider that as well. We can have a consultant or a firm that does this work and comes and looks at all of our programs, the continuum of supports of special education students, outplacements, what's happening internally for special ed. But we also need to develop the long-term plan from the sustainability perspective. And so we should think about if it's going to be an audit and then what.
I have a concern, and I don't know if this is the time and place, but sometimes back to the case that I mentioned, it seemed like, to me, there may have not been a need for a 45-day diagnosis. It's like there's a PPT. If you're following it, then we would know if that doesn't work and we need to adjust. But at the school level, if you're not following the PPT, then it grows into something else, and then you need to be at another school because we don't know what's wrong because we're not doing our job as Hartford Public Schools. So I'm wondering, do we create some of these situations ourselves because we're not following this document, which we are supposed to be following? So I don't know if schools need help with that, but it just seemed like this case, it didn't even need that. It just needed, the PPT just needed to be followed, so, we could figure out in school what's wrong, how do we adjust and address, the behavior. So that's what I struggle with, like it didn't even have to go there. So we kind of created our own issue in the bill that I'm quite sure was high in number.
As a result of compliance or the lack thereof.
It seemed like the PPT was not followed. Nothing was consistent. It was you're gonna run these tests on him, and then it's like, oh, I couldn't do that because I had another responsibility in the school, and it just was crazy. And this just happened to be someone I worked with, and it was like, no, I think I want to come with you, because it just was that the testing or whatever that needed to happen within the school never happened, and it was most times because the staff member had other responsibilities within the school or just was making up excuses as to why that it wasn't being done when the parents started to learn how to ask the right questions. So it just seemed like it went from that to now we're not going to figure out what's wrong. We need help to even figure out what's wrong. So then it escalated to the point where I kind of felt like, at the time I was a parent advocate, I wasn't on the board, but I kind of felt like because I was in the room, it kind of got this special attention, and it was like, no, the mom just wanted you to do, and dad wanted you to do what you were supposed to do at school level, but then you're bringing certain people to your meetings, and it's like, we're gonna do everything now. Now we're gonna offer you this, you can pick these schools, which one do you want? And it was very weird to be sitting there, but I just don't think it had to get to this point. So if we're doing a better job within the schools, doing what we're supposed to do, that's on paper and documented and agreed upon, then some of these outplacements may not become outplacements. I just think it's because I'm hopefully that we've started to do a better job, because this was at least 2 years ago. But I just felt that was one situation, and I'm wondering how many other situations is just like that.
And I think when we think about an audit, those are the cases, right, that we can, or that the consulting firm can really do a root cause into to determine the rate of placement and whether or not those were necessary.
I have a question. So this is a lot of information to kind of absorb. But the first bullet point when we're looking at ways to sort of mitigate these rising costs is to reduce the overall identification of students with disabilities, right? And I think there's a lot to say, and I realize like the moment that we're in the position that we're in, but if students are not identified early within our system, they have what we call cumulative disadvantage throughout life, right? So I know that when we went through sort of like our crisis around the Office of the Child Advocate, we put out a call to individuals and we said, hey, you know, there was a lot of messaging around like making sure that you report a thing, right? If you see anything, whether or not, you know, no matter how, you know, it may look like, always just report, right? And there were some consequences to that, right? Even though we were trying to err on doing the right thing. And we had some conversation around a policy that was related to disciplinary actions that take place in schools. And we talked about how there's a lack of behavior techs in the schools, and school safety officers are being called in numerous times to address things that should be addressed by a behavior tech. And this is so layered because it seems as though, at least anecdotally, this is a coping mechanism for staff that may be under-resourced, right? And so an individual will end up in a placement when, as Ms. Brody was saying, they probably needed the steps in between, right? So when we're looking at strategies to kind of reduce and mitigate, and I know I'm rambling in this moment, when we're looking at strategies to control cost, I don't know that, I do not feel like this should be the first bullet, because the overall consequences that could mean for our students, if we message this to staff about reducing the overall identification of students, it would be that people who need it most would not get it. And for our students, that means that they're going to have cumulative disadvantage throughout their entire life by not being addressed. If you tried to get tested as an adult, like, the cost is astronomical, right? So if you're not identified in public school, like K through 12, you can forget about it. I mean, I used to work at a college where you had college-age students at a very expensive private liberal arts college who were receiving support services for learning disabilities and other sorts of things that helped them to graduate and get a degree. And do you understand what I'm saying? So it's really critical that our students who do have disabilities are identified, but I understand the messiness of the piece in between about maybe staff feeling under-resourced and as a result kind of pulling this lever too soon. Does that make sense? So I have some concerns there around that as a strategy. And then I also wonder how far off we are from as a board, our purview is governance. So I'm wondering if we have any legislative recourse, maybe with other partners throughout the state, in order to build that. And I'd like to talk more about standardizing the cost across as opposed to that first bullet point. And also, maybe we could have some controlled partnerships around cost that we vet and we say, okay, here is an HPS partner. This is a facility that we know provides the range of services, and we have a pre-negotiated contract with them in terms of what they will price for this, like a competitive rate in terms of us using them. So a lot of thoughts on this.
I absolutely agree with you with that first bullet. That is not something that I would personally put in a presentation, especially as the first way that you can help to reduce these costs. This PowerPoint is entirely generated by Education Resource Strategy, so I completely understand your concern. And I do know I'm mostly forward-facing to the state legislature, and there has been a lot of conversation, especially recently with regards to a standardized identification statewide and providing some additional state guidance with regards to the identification of students with disabilities. So yes, I understand your concern and your reaction to that first bullet.
I want to also add that when we first got this presentation, I recall ERS juxtaposing it with slide 13 around the rate of identification for students, and the fact that, comparable to Bridgeport and New Haven, that we still are, the highest, we have the highest rate of identification, and even the conversations that we have with State Department of Education around, are we over-identifying our students? And do we then, in order to reduce the over-identification, that means that we have to have a continuum of supports for all students that is, identifying resources and providing the resources at Tier 2 and at Tier 3 before a student becomes identified as, a special education student. So I recall that conversation, initially when ERS lifted it, because, the conversation was, well, if a student needs supports, we can't not service a student, and we cannot, follow through with a PPT-1, if you will, right? That's the law. We have to, and we have a commitment to our students. So just wanted to give that added background, Ms. Taylor, on that, which I think when we think about the audit can not only be around outplacement of students, it has to look at the entire continuum and how a student does get into that, the special ed continuum. Because there are, as you know, significant steps that have to happen before. And at times, just because the student is recommended for, PPT-1, it doesn't always have to end with an IEP.
Awesome. Additionally, another thing that is a question for me is almost like the interchangeable language between student with disability and special education. In a presentation like this, I would love to be able to see it clearly defined, especially when we're talking about differentiated learning within classrooms. So it would be really helpful for me to understand what demographic are we actually talking about when we're saying students with disabilities and special education. Like, what is the statutory definition for those things?
I'd like to agree with Ms. Taylor. I think a lot of our children that are in special education don't have cognitive or physical impairments, but their issues are around early childhood trauma. And I know that's the case with my own children, who are not my biological children, but came to me later. And I think we have a lot of work to do, and this goes back to points that Ms. Browdy was raising, in resourcing our staff and training them. And I think for a lot, and I don't want to sound, I don't want to come across I'm trying to put down the staff, but my own experience with my own child was that classifying him special ed, sending him to an outplacement, was a way of ridding themselves of a problem that they didn't know how to handle. So I think that's an issue that we need to address.
If I can chime in, I agree with everyone, with what everyone said, and I guess my question would be, beyond just looking at special education or students with disabilities, when you, in respect to the IEP, when the student has an IEP, and I don't want to put words in Ms. Brody's mouth, but we don't do a good job of following that IEP, and we do it to ourselves. So we might say to it, because my oldest son had an IEP, and so he's going to have these particular structures and interventions in place, but then you don't have those particular professionals in the building. And you knew that when you were writing up the IEP. And so we literally cut our own throat or cut our nose to spite our face because we're writing an IEP that we know we can't fulfill the second that we finish dotting the I and crossing the T. So my question is, looking at the system in and of itself, how there's only, 8 hours in a day, 6 to 8 hours in a school day, and how are we maximizing that? We have, majority of our classrooms have tier 2 and tier 3 students in them anyway. And so if we're talking about possibly restructuring or rethinking the way we do business, is that a possibility? I know we can't have a whole classroom concentrated with special needs students and things of that nature. You have to have them integrated, but if a teacher has students in the classroom and they don't have the supports to help the students, that's one obstacle. And then if that student doesn't get the help, they fall further behind. And then we create the special need or the student that needs the IEP and needs the intervention. So I guess I'm sort of in the same neighborhood as Ms. Brody. How do we rethink education? Because what we're talking about is, how do we restructure the school environment, the school day, and restructure education so we can hit some of these measures, get our kids to the structures and the standards that they're supposed to be, and at the same time deal with the social emotional. Because a lot of our kids, 60% of our kids are in a challenging school environment. But then if you look at the things that are going outside in our community, it is fully representative of the fact that we're not supporting our kids in school. And I'm not trying to blame the superintendent or teachers, but we know that if a teacher is spending more time disciplining in classroom than teaching, then no one's going to receive an education. And if we're not dealing with the cultural issues that permeate in the hallways, in the bathrooms, that is another impediment to education. So I'm simply saying, if we're going to do an audit, are we auditing how these students receive services in classroom, in the setting at the same time? So, for example, if a para has to spend 90 minutes with this particular student, but then they are supposed to service 10 students, how do they manage that? If we don't do one-on-ones anymore, we're going to continue to do one-on-ones. So, because that's a larger part of the issue, because I know if you gave me an option, I'm going to want my child to have a one-on-one. If you give me that option. If you give me that option, and I'm in a failing school, I'm going to pick any number one of these schools to get my child the education and services that they want. And so I can't fault a parent for wanting the best for their child, but I also wonder if we have state facilities that can offset these costs. Are we thinking about just looking at the school day as a whole, re-examining how we deliver services, how schools are structured? We talked about 2 teachers in 1 classroom. Would that be a better way to resource and meet the need? So my question is, how far out of the spectrum can we think and make suggestions and make recommendations and try to craft proposals to really move this conversation? Because this is I don't know what session we're in. If we're in a short session or a long session. I think we're in a short session. Never mind.
I think that in addition,
For the long session.
In addition to the audit, we still have to do our regular work around developing, the multi-tier system of supports, which is how do we meet the needs of all students, whether they're regular ed or special education students in tier 1, and then go up in the continuum, which is part of the process of identifying students as special education students. But it requires building a lot of the capacity in our staff, not just special education, which, by the way, there is a shortage, not only locally in the state, but across the nation. But how do we build capacity in regular ed staff to address, for example, the other social, emotional, behavioral challenges that might show up for students because they need supports. So it's not just the audit.
I can make a comment into what Ms. Taylor was saying earlier about allies. Last week, I was at a chairman's roundtable at CADE, the Association of Boards of Education, and I would just get together and talk about the problems in our districts, and I raised this one. And no one had raised it before, but once I raised it, everyone around the table experiencing the same thing, and they're trying to find ways. They don't have the percentages that we do, but it still is an issue for most districts. And I think we can reach out to allies and try to, as a group, as an industry, address the legislature and try to find relief for some of these issues.
So this question is for the superintendent. So in advance of, or in the interim between now and the consultants coming in to do this audit and evaluation, what are some of the strategies that we are currently employing to mitigate and control cost? It seems really unreasonable for our financial positioning to have an expense that is completely uncontrollable. Thinking about it like my little dinner budget, it's like you never know how much I'm going to spend from month to month. I mean, just, times millions, right? So what are we doing in the interim to be able to kind of mitigate these costs? What are your strategies in this moment for this academic year?
Yeah, so we currently are working to some of the students that are in the special education continuum right now. We are developing programming in district, and so we now have additional spaces for our RISE programming. We are going to be looking to develop a program for K-5, potentially a standalone program in one of our facilities, for example, that we are going to have open or vacant. So those are things that we're exploring. We are placing students right now, throughout our district instead of sending them out to an outplacement.
And additionally, I'm wondering, do the students, sort of like primary care physicians or medical providers, have any responsibility in terms of providing some of the support for this, or is there a way to partner? I know that this sounds kind of off, I have no clue, I'm just asking, because especially if it's like an emotional behavioral disorder or anything along those lines, developmental stuff, maybe there is some partnership that could happen there.
So depending on the
I
IEP,
see Kim kind of looking up like,
Like I'm saying, it's insurance. I was going to say the same thing.
depending on the IEP, if it does require, we have students that have multiple, complex disabilities, and so it does require, a multidisciplinary approach beyond the instructional piece. And so we do partner, but it's a partnership because it just has to, the IEP has to be met. And so whether it is through doctors, we do engage in our Medicaid, billing process as well, which is another strategy that we're going to have to look at. How do we get better at making sure that we bill appropriately so we can continue to explore the partnership? But if a IEP requires, we have to partner.
So I don't really know, I don't even really know what I'm asking, right? Because I'm not on the ground, I don't know what it looks like, but I'm wondering if there's a professional development opportunity for our staff to understand better, like the insurance billing process, to be able to say, okay, these are the pieces that HPS should definitely cover because this is within our purview, but here are some things in terms of like programs externally that wouldn't necessarily result in a cost to us. But if that's like a professional development opportunity for staff to understand what those things are, to be able to bucket those out as a cost savings measure for us.
You mean to have someone else deliver the service?
If it's appropriate, right? So I don't even know what I could give as an example, but you get what I'm saying.
I
So
get
maybe
what
there
you're
are some
saying.
things that maybe you can do it through group counseling services, right? That could be billed through insurance as opposed to looking at something that's happening in school, like pulling in an external resource that could be billed to insurance, because it really should be covered.
Billable.
You know
It
what
is
I mean?
billable. The other piece that I will raise is for students that are, special education students that are, either in magnets or open choice. We have to pay the bill. That team, that IEP determines, that team determines the IEP, and we have providers that determine what the cost is. So we just have to pay. Like there's no say in what we get billed for some of the services.
But there are definite, and this is more of a conversation, it's like we're on the phone. But there are definitely opportunities for us to be able to partner with districts like through CREC, through Open Choice, to say, hey, here are the issues that we're facing in terms of cost, and asking them to show up more as true partners in this work in terms of being able to mitigate costs, whether it's a legislative agenda long-term or if it's controlling costs through channels that they have contracts and partnerships with.
One thing we did have a conversation about internally was, to just assess the landscape, because there is a variance in terms of what we are charged for. Some providers charge very differently than others do for the same service. And so, again, I wonder if the situation that we've been in, without just this lack of oversight is not the right word that I'm looking for, but it's what comes input. I don't know if we had the opportunity to give input. Do we have the capacity to stop, right, and create some space and time? This is, I think, now we're in a better place to have people on our team that are, monitoring the billing, for example, the Medicaid billing. Those were investments that we made last year as part of our budget, to have dedicated staff members to do that work. These were resources that we didn't have before. So I think it's a combination of, yes, the collaboration, the input, but also doing that broad brush assessment as to what is this landscape that we're all trying to understand. And I do believe that the state has a big part in that process. Because when you speak to other districts, they might have, 50 students in their entire district that are outplaced, but the challenges are still the same. It's just that we just have, a much larger number of students.
I have a question.
I don't know that I answered your question, Ms. Taylor, but.
Just speaking to billing, and I don't know if you do this or not, so I'm just going to ask the question. So if I receive Medicaid or something to that effect of state insurance, and my child has an issue, is it possible to change that PPT process? So now part of that process requires me to take what I've done in this PPT to the pediatrician and get a referral, and then that way it's on the state insurance and not on our insurance. And then, I'm just asking the question out loud, because the point is, if we can shift the cost, and again, I don't mean to be grimy out on television, but if we can shift the cost and make the state pick it up, and they're picking it up anyway because they're paying for the insurance, can we figure out a way to do that? Is that way far out of bounds? Has anyone even discussed it? Because, for example, if the child needs a speech therapist and the doctor makes a referral, can the insurance pay for it and not us?
If, not if it's part of the educational process. I mean, it becomes part of it. But it's, so we own the IEP, so the
I get that, but
district,
the point that I'm making is, if I have an impediment or a disability, and the pediatrician agrees that I have this diagnosis and it's a sound diagnosis, can't we just say, oh, it was a medical diagnosis? It wasn't part of the PPT. The PPT recommended that mom take the child to the pediatrician and then try to figure out finish the evaluation on that. I mean, I know it's grimy. I know. But
oh, well, then you're talking about a 504 plan, right?
okay, so
If the
yeah.
doctor,
all right.
because then that means that whatever the challenge is, is creating a barrier for the students to have access to the regular educational process.
My question: do we have to pick up, because we can diagnose a 504, but then once it comes to the services, is that all right?
We provide, that's a whole nother
Yeah, I figured I felt that going on.
line item, if you will, in terms of 504 service delivery.
This is complicated.
504, yes. But we get reimbursement, right? We get the reimbursement from Medicaid, but it's through us. We have to do all that process. We can have another workshop on how all of it works. It's, lots of details in those.
Can I just ask one clarification? I know we keep saying the state and Medicaid, but also through private insurance as well, or only when it's Medicaid?
Private
Medicaid.
insurance as well.
Medicaid.
Okay.
Just-
Wait, only Medicaid?
No.
For special education service delivery? Yep, I'm looking at Dr. Sellers.
So you're talking about when a family has insurance, you want to know if those insurance services can pay for in-school, for services delivered in school, is that what you're asking?
As part of the IEP.
So
That's-
it could possibly, but that's a policy.
That's.
Sometimes it's a state policy issue where private providers are actually allowed in the public schools. That's not a policy we currently have, but something that we might want to look at.
So just to ask a point of clarification, I'm aware of another districts, they'll have like Wheeler Clinic is in the school, and it's
Correct.
some type of an outlet, right? So that's Medicaid billable, but it should also be private insurance billable, because if you're going for, I don't know, you need counseling for whatever reason,
They come to the school.
yeah, they could go to the school, they have a credentialed practitioner.
So we do have MOUs with Wheeler Clinic, with the Village. There are cases where we do have MOUs with those organizations.
But those are not just for special education
So
students.
not just for, right.
Yeah, could be for any student.
So, and this may be going back to your point about $250,000 is not enough, because we've talked a lot about a lot of things here. But it sounds like, in terms of the kind of bucket of ideas, and kind of let's go crazy on this could be one of those where it's like, yes, those MOUs are for all students, because all students can use supports, obviously, we want all our students to be supported. But they could also be, how is it that we're helping to ensure any student that is identified through the IEP that there are certain on-site services? Because if we're seeing the numbers we're seeing here, going back to just, again, conceptually, we're outplacing students, and how are we able to keep them in district? If we know many of our students need supports, and it makes more sense to have somebody on-site in the school, that would be very, I think, should assist the student holistically, and especially from a lot of other issues in terms of social emotional, connections with peers, connections with their staff and the school, et cetera. I'm just wondering, is that another thing that could be added to this? So kind of going back to the point of, I think that, we're talking about an audit and some other stuff, right? So, because I think part of this is we need to, and a few of my colleagues here have mentioned long-term and short-term, midterm, but I do think it feels like, what can we do immediately to maybe have some low-hanging fruit, and also what is it that we need to do in terms of that long-term planning, right? And collectively, all of that probably is going to be more than obviously a $250,000 kind of investment. But I'm sure we'll have some real return on investment, not just financially for us as a district, but also for the experience and learning for our students and their families. So yeah, I just feel like we're having a really good conversation, but it feels bigger than even the audit, right? So, okay.
It's very big. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
So can I have a little bit of clarification on the fourth bullet point that talks about shed in-district special ed costs as students leave the district, review school data for significantly underfilled classes, and cluster undersized self-contained programs to help meet staffing targets? I'm not sure that I understand what all of that means. Slide 21, bullet point 4.
So when students leave, there might be, the class size could potentially get smaller. And so it's an opportunity for us to collapse a class. Not saying that that's the best thing to do, as we just saw, a wave of that throughout our district, and it creates, as you know, impact on all students, special ed and regular ed students. And then clustering the undersized self-contained programmings to help meet staffing needs. I mentioned earlier that we have pockets of the RISE programs throughout the district, and if we don't have those fully enrolled, then that's another challenge for us. Just like we saw when we had schools that were under-enrolled. It's the same issue in the special education self-contained programs.
And lastly, I'm wondering, for some of those cases that are kind of like outliers in terms of the amount of the expense, do we do like our own sort of like oversight audit of maybe a bill that comes in that's $100,000 or $200,000? Like, do we have special case instances? If you get a water bill and you're like, what's the what? Like, you go and check that the toilet is running. It's like, oh, like that was the cause of like the major cost here in this area.
We have now pulled all of that data. It's actually work that we're doing with the Municipal Accountability Review Board that's very interested in just looking at all, going into the weeds on all of that. Quite frankly, we do not have the capacity to look at all. We should, right, to have, as with any bill that we get, have an opportunity to cross-reference. It is work that is just starting, Ms. Taylor.
But when I look at slide 20, right, and these dots represent students in our district, yes, and outplacements. So like if we have a dot that's just kind of chilling over here in $110,000, we don't take an extra look at that particular file?
We do,
Oh, that one, okay.
but there are many. Right, so the one on the top there, Lisa, for example, that 105, that represents a placement, a facility. A facility.
A facility and the average cost per student at that facility.
So there might be 50 students at
So
that
wait a minute,
facility.
so the bar on the bottom, I don't know that the graph is labeled well. So the bar, the horizontal numbers across there, that is the number of facilities, not the number of students
That's the number of students at that individual facility.
at that
So
particular.
at Oak Hill, for example, it would be approximately 50 students located at Oak Hill.
Got it.
At 105 or 110.
Okay, so 50 at Oak Hill, maybe about 110, and then this one right here is a facility that's just not labeled?
Correct, they only labeled certain. I
Certain
could
ones.
see if I can get the breakdown from them on each individual provider. No, those students might have just exceptional needs. I'm not sure of what the breakdown is of what the services that are being provided by that provider are. That could
Yeah.
definitely contribute to the higher cost.
But I'm just thinking that even if you had to look at 51 higher cost students as opposed to, the number of students who are actually in outplacement, you get what I'm saying? Like, those are the higher cost ones, and even if it's 50 at $100,000, we're talking about, was that $500,000?
So I think there are two things. One, looking at the bill that comes in, and then service delivery, right? A bill is one thing, but are the students really, even accessing? This is something that the child advocate and I have discussed in detail as to, chronic absenteeism, for example, of students in those facilities, and and those are the students that we outplace, right? They are also the students that other districts and other magnet providers outplace, that we just pay the bill.
So I want to ask another question. So, thank you, Lisa, for 15 minutes. It's turned into much more than that. Going to the slide 23, where we talk about what are some other things that we need to do for DME. It feels like we're consistently talking about the need to have staff who are looking at these bills, and also, I don't want to call it case management, but the person who can dig a little bit deeper, and even because going back to my insurance days, that, we have some high claims, and usually an insurance company, you would have somebody with the right expertise and skill set that could take a look at that case file and also at times provide additional support to the staff and also the family. But it sounds like that's a little bit what we're talking about, and I feel like we need to add a puzzle piece. I know this is not great news for there to be another thing to consider, but I'm hearing a trend. And as we move into budget development, I think we need to keep our eye on this, that at least a minimum, again, going back to what are some quote-unquote low-hanging fruit, and maybe they're not hanging so low, but how is it that we could, if we did have a staff person that was doing that, in addition to you've already expanded some staff, but if we had a staff person that was doing these type of things we're talking about, will we be able to have some key savings automatically just by making sure the case file looks good, the bill looks like it's good, we're optimizing and maximizing, and on the flip side, ensuring high-quality services to that student and family. So I feel like we need to add another puzzle piece.
Yes to all of that, absolutely. I know that Dr. Sellers I know, because we talk about this all the time, and were there 2 positions that were added for this year, Dr. Sellers? 2 already?
We had one with our Medicaid revenue reimbursement program, and then I think we're gonna have another one.
We're in the process.
So, I guess I agree. I think we should do that. I wonder how we can do that when we are always bumping up against these large deficits and we always have to cut. So we have to consider that because this budget is going to affect operationally how we deliver services. I guess my question, and forgive me for asking this aloud, but it just popped in my head. Unfortunately, we had a negative experience with Oak Hill, and as a result, the child advocate is in our life. And so I'm wondering if Oak Hill failed to manage that particular student, they failed to report he was not attending, so forth and so on. Why are we still doing business with Oak Hill, or did we sue them, and are we getting some of our money back? And maybe that's kind of a question for the city lawyer, but yeah, I just thought of that because I just saw Oak Hill. So.
Good, thank you.
So one piece of data that I think is missing, I know y'all ready to wrap up, but I got one more. One piece of data that I think is missing is who is referring who where, right? So I think it's on slide 20. Nope, I think it's 19. Where we talk about private outplacements. by magnet, open choice, private, right? So some of this obviously is through the lottery process where individuals are attending magnets or open choice schools, but it seems like the absorbent, I don't know how you say that word, but the excessive cost is caused by the private placements. And I'm wondering if there is a way for us to understand who is making the referrals to private placements, just to be able to have that comparative tool in terms of where students start versus where they end up.
I asked that question. I wasn't given a definitive internally, and I even, asked the team at the state. We recently had a meeting with the state folks, and they didn't seem too confident that they could provide that information in terms of like longitudinally. We did put it in. We did ask the question. The entire state Department of Education pretty much was there. Because I wanted to know, when a student leaves Hartford and goes into a magnet school, do we identify them? Do they identify them?
Inconclusive.
Did you get the sense that it was? Absolutely. So a child participating in open choice can then be outplaced by that district that they are participating in open choice. So, and then Hartford just gets the bill.
So when in the process was the request? How can we get data that shows when in the student's learning experience, for example, were they identified? Were they with us when they were identified? Were they outplaced with us, or were they identified and outplaced externally? Don't know how we could get at that data. Certainly we can't get it. And when we asked the state, I'm wondering if we can certainly get it. As I think about the students that are with us,
So like a process of elimination, we could probably do our own data where these are the students
Internally.
that we placed, and then so the rest of these students were placed by someone else, even though we don't know. But that's, if you're creating
But
like
it
a
would
larger
be-
story, like a narrative, right,
Yep.
to understand, it's helpful to have that.
But for years, we've been so staffed in that area. We've never had the personnel. We haven't had enough personnel to actually go to some of these PPTs when these diagnoses were being made. So that's another part of the reason why we're behind the ball on that.
but the data does show that there's not the rate of identification is not higher, by another provider compared to us. Like everyone is just identifying students relatively the same in terms of the rate.
But I do think one slight difference is, that kid's coming from Hartford, so we don't care about the cost. So, because we don't have to incur it. So because I do it.
That could also be something that you legislatively ask for with your delegation, is that if a student is going to be outplaced by the open choice district, that it goes back to Hartford, that they're a Hartford student again. So that therefore the district has the ability to control where they go in the class, or more of an ability.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that is not the end of the workshop, because we now pivot to the budget allocation presentation and our budget timeline and where we are in terms of the budget. So this is probably like a 45 slide presentation. I will not go through all to the entire presentation. The entire presentation covers essentially where the money to fund our schools comes from, who makes the decisions about how money is allocated, what information do we take into account when we allocate money, and then the flexibilities. So some of this information is carried over from last year as it relates to a budget development process. So I'm going to kind of chunk the presentation. So I'm going to go to page 6, and I don't have the clicker. Is there a clicker? No, there's a clicker. Oh, thank you. Oh, it's not up. Okay, so we can, until it comes up, we can just go through the handout. So where the money comes from, slide 7 just gives you the overall and where we are in terms of, $430 million budget. The next few slides speak to the state dollars that come in, and then, of course, the local contributions. So it's background information. The next section, starting on slide 10, is pretty much just our demographics. Who are we? The number of programs and schools that we have, and then the student body that we have.
Good evening, FMSA parents. This is Mr. Colon. I'd like to thank all parents for coming out to tonight's parent-teacher conference. The time is now 7 p.m., and our parent-teacher conferences will be wrapping up. Again, we'd like to thank you for coming out, and please remember to stop by the PTO table to sign up on your way out. Thank you, and have a safe ride home.
Somebody's working for their bonus. You work for that bonus.
The next, what bonus? The next part of the presentation. Thank you, Chris. Oh no, almost. It's not clicking. Is that me? Am I making it work? Okay, great. It's not working. Here's where we are. So who decides how money gets to a school? No. Yes? It's good. I apologize for all that. Who decides how money gets to a school? This is new information that we added based on feedback from our school leaders, feedback that came from SGCs as to really wanting to know all of the stakeholders involved in the process, and central office, school leaders, and SGCs, elected officials, and community members. And the next 4 slides just explain exactly how each stakeholder group is involved in the process. Again, the purpose of this presentation in this way is that we wanted it to be accessible to everyone, to all stakeholder groups. And so it might appear that it's a little more detailed than it was last year. Going to take us to slide 20, the next section, which is what is considered when creating a school budget. This is a slide that should be familiar because it was introduced during last year's budget process. And again, the themes that we were trying to address emerged from the feedback that we got from engaging SGCs, but primarily our school leaders when they told us that they wanted a budget process that was transparent, equitable, that provided the stability given that we were going to right-size the way that some schools received their funding, that it allowed flexibility for principals, school leaders to identify how to best meet the needs of their schools, that it was a timely budget, and that, of course, that it aligned to our strategic priorities. A reminder on page 22 of what our school starter budget looks like. What everyone pretty much starts with. We want to be intentional in, as you see on slide 23, in reminding our community that a starter budget can change and how a starter budget can change. Of course, as you know, enrollment in each school, the district model of excellence, we make strategic investments to support the DME, and those might look different year to year based on specific data point that we might want to address. Our district priorities, again, we might decide that we need to shift. And then, of course, the resources that we have. We want to make sure that, yes, we start with a starter budget and that we meet the needs of our schools in the district. But if the money is not available, as you know, then we have to recalibrate our approach. So the starter budget might look different. We did have the specific additions last year that were added in terms of the English learners, student engagement specialists, and Magna School supplemental grant. As you know, we made a decision last year to not fully remove all of the Magna funding, given that we did not want to compromise, a significant shift in schools and the way that they were operating as well. And so we're starting the budget with those assumptions as well this year. And page 25 just gives you a quick visual. In terms of the flexibility, this is something that our school leaders were quite vocal about last year, and this year when I recently met with them, making sure that they have some level of flexibility. So I just wanted to provide there what the flexibility allocation was last year per grade level. As you see there, pre-K, it was 342 per student. The middle school was a little more, and then of course 542 at the high school level. We do want to still provide flexibility for our school leaders. A reminder that we do have to think about the spending and how it might look different across the district. As you know, English learners, chronically absent, schools that have high rates of chronic absenteeism, the funding might look different. But then other things to consider there is just a grade level. We know that schools that are in the lower grades do require more teachers, and then the size, we learned that as we had to think about how we were going to right-size the district. We know the implications of having smaller schools is very hard to service not only the students, but meet the needs of the adults in schools that are under-enrolled. This is a new, something that we have to all mind. During this budget season, the education financial system is something that the state is getting ready to roll out. Lisa, do you know what, next few weeks? Within the next few months. This is a requirement that is part of ESSA, Every Student Succeed Act, and it requires that each SCA, state education agency, release information as to funding and funding allocations for every district and for every school. And so the State Department of Education will be releasing reports at the district level and for each and every school. And I wanted to just lift that there because at some point throughout our budget development process this year, we are probably going to get questions about the EFS and the fact that it might show very different numbers than what we're showing. And I don't mean in terms of the overall allocation, the $430 million. That's not what I mean. But, it might show that a school is getting $22,000 per pupil versus another school getting $14,000 per pupil. But we have to really have time together to really explain why that might look different. I will give you one example. If I understand it correctly, they currently pool all of the special education staff. We have all special education staff connected to central office's budget, and so it appears that we're either not staffing schools appropriately in special education when we are. I know this is like very in the weeds, but I felt that it was important to have it there because I assume that at some point we're going to have to respond potentially to media inquiries about this. The next portion of the slide, I will not go into the details, but it's the very detailed budget timeline, and there are specific buckets, if you will. As you see, they're color-coded. The yellow is making sure that we develop stakeholder engagement in understanding the budget process and the allocation formula. That will take place throughout the entire process up until May, when I present the budget to you as a board, making sure that there's time for our school leaders to understand the allocations and give them time to determine their flexibilities that are available to them. This is something that we have added this year. It was not part of the budget development process last year, aside from presenting to City Council, which you know that we have to do. We have added a presentation to the Governor's Office, the Office of Policy and Management, and the State Department of Education on next year's budget process and our financial sustainability. And then also presenting to our delegation on the current budget process, and then, of course, our long-term district sustainability strategy. Wasn't there last year. We feel that it is very important, especially given the conversations that we're having around special education and the larger implications. Also made space during the timeline to support our school leaders in making strategic staffing and budget decisions that are right for their schools. This is very detailed, but some of the pieces that were lifted by our leaders, specifically our assistant principals, was that they felt they weren't really part of the budget process, and feedback was given to us that they, wanted to be part of that process so that they can also speak to their families about it, not just the school principal, but it also to provide them with an opportunity to build their capacity as future school leaders in our schools. They wanted to understand the budget development process. We also wanted to allow additional time for our school leaders to interact with central office, specific central office departments, and give ample time for them to have those conversations, especially as it relates to special education and English, our EL department. And lastly, the blue is when we get to the end of the budget process, where we have the workshop, the hearing, and then the presentation to you all. So that was just pretty much the technical aspect of the budget development process. Now we get to our current state.
Can I just ask a quick
Yes.
question? Going back to this last slide, when it's the budget development process, is for the budget recommendation for us and presenting it to us. So one of the things we talked about is process, and this looks great, and I feel like we've come so far since like 2 years ago. One of my questions, though, is I know the budget continues to be worked, right? And one of the things that's been challenging as board members is as the numbers are changing and trying to also balance the fact that we're also asking questions and asking you guys to change. So I'm just thinking about, as this is set up here, and I know that kind of, I don't know if that's an asterisk or whatever, but it's one of those things that we talked about in terms of, at one point, the numbers need to be static, so we could at least have time to fully, absorb, and know that's asking a lot and trying to figure that out, but I'm hoping you guys could consider that as you're developing the budget, but this has been very helpful. Thank you.
Would like to hear just even some suggestions that you might have as to when that potential cutoff. Is it a month? Is it, before the budget, 2 weeks before the budget workshop? Is it after the budget workshop? So yes. So it's a yes and. Let us know. Give me some ideas as to what's doable on your end, because we can certainly shift, the timeline to make sure that there's time to dive, take a deep dive.
Okay, that'd be great. Maybe we can talk about that in committee. But, thank you.
Sorry, I have a question, and maybe Could you talk a little bit further on the magnet school supplemental? And I want to make sure my memory is serving me correctly.
So there were schools that ranged anywhere from, I don't know the starting number, but that went up to $1,100. Some schools were getting an additional $1,100 per student last year. And we did not want to say, well, let's take the entire $1,100 from the magnet school, because we felt that it would compromise the integrity of their program, their theme, the experience. And so we left it at the midway point, saying $500. So magnet schools get an additional $500 currently.
And when you say we and take, so you were considering, because I'm trying to understand how you're able to take it. I guess I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. Because are we talking about money that is allocated to magnet schools because of the Chef versus O'Neill lawsuit? Like, I don't understand. I'm trying to fully understand that.
So the magnet schools, all the magnet schools get their state allocated amount from the magnet operating grant. The supplemental actually comes from the general budget. So it's beyond what is allocated to them by the magnet grant from the state. So in the formula that was created last year, the board, anywhere between $500 to $1,100, depending on the grades or the program of the school, came out of the general operating budget. So it was beyond what every school is required to get through the magnet operating grant. So
and this is our general budget?
Our general budget.
Okay, so somewhere along the line, leadership said this should be what these schools get. And now the current leadership took another look at that to propose the 500 as opposed to some getting a little more than that. Is that correct?
That is
Absolutely.
correct.
Okay, that was one question. And the other is, are we probably going along the same lines of, because I expressed last budget season that I struggled with if a student does not need English as a second language services and they're not chronically absent, but they are deficient in reading or math, how does that look? Because it looks like if you have those two issues going on, you're getting this extra money poured at you. But if you do not fit that criteria, what extra are you getting?
So that's a great question. So when you go into kind of equity-based budgeting, you're looking at needs from high to low levels. So as we look, we knew as a district last year that there was a urgent need to address chronic absenteeism in majority of our schools, hence creating that formula that allowed for schools to receive the additional support. The same is true for the L population. That does not mean that that schools who have demonstrated based on looking at their data, whether it's through the school progress review, through their SIP plans, through the feedback they get from the SGCs, that they see a need where they would like instructional support in the area of literacy or numeracy or science materials. That's where the flexibility happens, and that's where the conversations with each of the departments happens around of what they actually need, and actually how can we actually adjust their budgets to meet the needs that are being demonstrated by evidence of their conversations, but also mainly by what the data is saying. So it does not preclude principals from actually asking for additional services that they may see that warrant. And many principals have done that in saying, I really don't need this additional staff person, I really need this person for my school because for these various reasons, and they've had that flexibility of doing those exchanges during the budget process.
I think it would be beneficial for when we're talking to the community about what we are doing with a budget, and when you are making that a priority, and you have a parent sit and say, my child is not proficient in English and reading and math, but they come to school every single day. I think it can get lost, because I was questioning on it a lot. So it can get lost in thinking that that's what you're focusing on, but what about me? So I think that conversation has to be brought to life for parents who are questioning that.
So one way that we can probably get at that is talk about the tiered supports. So every school, depending on what our data is saying, should have tier 2 supports in math and in literacy. And so perhaps we have to find a way to, one, when we're presenting, to clearly specify that it doesn't mean that the only supports that are coming to a school are for EL and chronically absent, so we can lift those others.
Absolutely.
And then perhaps in some of our frequently asked questions, we should probably add that too.
And I would add also that I think going through this for the first time last year, there was a lot of great conversations and feedback giving. And one of the things that we also want to make sure that we highlight is, and I think that Dr. Torres Rodriguez articulated it very well, is that there's a lot of centralized support coming from central office that don't really surface at a school budget. So when we look at the investment that the board has made on these families, school resource providers, the impact has been very positive and great in making sure being accessible to families. The additional student engagement specialists, they might not appear on the local school budget, but they are at a central office budget, but they're actually in schools every single day, working around student engagement and chronic absenteeism and making the impact. And you probably saw the initial data results. The first time we've seen our kindergarten attendance go up in a positive way is these investments that we're saying. So to your point, Ms. Brody, it's important to have those conversations and highlight those great investments that, because of the decisions that were made last year, moving forward, highlighting how these investments have shown positive student outcomes and educating our families as we go through this process.
I can see how someone would wonder, because it doesn't, you can't see it in the allocation.
But you can see the chronic absenteeism, and then
That's
the
exactly
ELO
right, yeah.
service. That is up front and center. We're making these extra investments, and families need to know what extra investment they are benefiting from.
So, like our coaches, right? Those are investments that are made that we house at central office, but are specifically to address literacy and math.
Our science curriculum, right? A middle school science curriculum for all schools. That was a huge investment that we've showed. But to your point, we have to kind of make sure we lift it so that people can actually see it, how it services all schools.
Good point. So we've seen this slide before. I think it's just important for us to ground on the history of the mitigations thus far, followed by slide 37, which is a lot of the highlights, if you will, the salient points from the ERS presentation as to some of the drivers and the deficit drivers. Of course, increasing tuition for magnet programs not run by Hartford Public Schools, the rising cost of special education services, the funding challenges, the reduction in our grants at the federal level, and flat funding from the city, and then, of course, our declining in-district enrollment. Recapping last year, We overcame a $12 million deficit, and if you remember, there were very specific moves that we made. One, reducing central office costs, eliminating contracts, big savings for the transportation contract and that renegotiation, and then making very difficult program and staff cuts, including our closures and our consolidations, which we continue to do this year. However, despite those measures, the challenges mentioned and the drivers still present us with deficits projected at $25 million for this year and $36 million for the following year. Currently, what's our thinking in terms of what we're doing, short-term and long-term? The systemic challenges, we all know they didn't just develop, they didn't show up at our door yesterday, but they are going to require a comprehensive approach. Short-term, we are going to finish implementing the DME, school consolidation plan. We are looking at a reorganizing, central office to see if there are potential efficiencies and better ways to even resources, for resources to go directly to schools. Increase the oversight of our out-of-district special education providers. This is, Ms. Taylor, to your comment earlier, and Ms. Oliver, specifically around Medicaid billing and ensuring that we are getting all the money that we are supposed to be getting in terms of the reimbursements. Strengthen the in-district special education options. We're looking to launch a pilot program next year. I mentioned earlier briefly for K-5 students, special education in-district program. The midterm, and I have the long-term there. The long-term is the ones that we've thought less about. But the midterm, working with state legislature around, the tuition costs specifically relevant to special education, and then the assessment of special education programming, the continuum, and how it is that we can ensure high-quality services for students in a way that's cost-effective for us without compromising, the obligation that we have and the commitment that we have to all of our students. Long-term, thinking about creating high-quality in-district programs in our schools, in our district. And then, the last bullet here, not that I'm making this suggestion, but looking at our past, and the fact that, enrollment will continue to decline, will we be faced again with having to think about facilities? Perhaps that should be like a question mark there. I wish I had more bullets to go, in these mid-level and long-term strategies around the budget. And then the last, slide here, which is really an out-facing slide. We want our community to be involved in our process, and I think together and engaging community in ways that can potentially help us, with our long-term financial sustainability is important. So. Working alongside of us to advocate around the special education challenges that we have, and even beyond local delegation, thinking about our congressional delegation, about negative impact of the reduction of the federal grants that can potentially happen. And I did have an appendix there. I'm not sure if it was you, Ms. Oliver, that asked about specific grants. So I just wanted to include it. Someone on the board asked about the grants at one point. And so just to have that transparent for our community. And then just sample, starter budget examples for our community to have. and then additional resources that will be available via live links on the web. So it's a broad brush to our budget development process and where we are, how we're starting in terms of our deficit. Clearly, as we go through the process, it'll get very detailed. You do also have with you a one-pager. This is something that we're going to be sharing with our schools, our parents, and our community. Is a condensed version of how a school budget process, what a school budget process looks like, and key dates for our community to be aware of.
I guess that concludes our workshop.
That concludes the workshop.
Now we have an executive session to go over some personnel matters and potential litigation. And we will bring, you're coming? Yes, no? Yeah. The superintendent and attorney Lori Meserak. Is there a motion to go into executive session?